Now we're going to go across the Pacific Ocean to the People's Republic of China, which has some big political events coming up here very soon. The 20th Congress of the the Communist Party of China, 101 years old. And to discuss a lot about that and what it says about where the country may be headed, we are very honored to be joined once again by Tings Chak, who is a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute and a member of the essential Dongsheng News Collective, which is covering everything China week to week. Tings, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
It's always a pleasure to join you both.
Well, let me just start here. I think most Americans, probably to the extent they've seen this, know that there's a big meeting of people in China who are politically in leadership. But give us maybe a sense of, what are these Chinese Communist Party congresses? What kind of things are decided there, or maybe have been decided in the past? Maybe just like some framing for what these meetings are, what they do, and then we can, I think, get into maybe more of what to expect from this particular meeting coming up next week.
Sure. I mean, it's a big question. I'm here in Beijing and we're all trying to figure it all out. But I think in order for us to sort of look forward, or even what's going on in the next few days, we have to look back a little bit at what the last two Congresses have really, steered the country in, so we can understand this moment we're living in. And so, taking us back to 10 years ago, Xi Jinping was elected the General Secretary of the CPC, and it kind of marked what's called the new era in China. So I want to bring a couple of things of what's been achieved over the last 10 years. And it's not, I could go into, the economy doubled, since 2012, or, some of the different gains socially, environmentally. But I want to point to one really important thing, which is the last speech that Hu Jintao, the former president, gave, which was kind of like the handing over of the baton to Xi Jinping. And in that speech, he mentioned corruption 16 times. And he actually said some very strong words, saying that, and I quote, "If the party fails to handle this issue of corruption, then this could cause the collapse of the party and the fall of the state." These are really strong words. And it's kind of funny to start there, but I think this really marks what the last two terms have really shown, which is a big effort on this question of corruption. And the first speech that she gave was looking at the tigers and the flies, which is really the people at the upper echelons of the party, but also at the grassroots level, because corruption, if you ask any Chinese person that was living in China 10 years ago, really felt. And so there, the party began a series of measures that's quite interesting. First of all, it was to look at, a cleanup of the party, things of exuberance, the kind of extravagance that was marked by the party. But a really important part, which I think we've talked about in previous shows, is this reconnection of the mass line, or a term that was used in the Mao Zedong era, of connecting the people with the party, or the party drawing its leadership and direction from the masses, really. So what instigated was a series of programs like, we've talked about the poverty alleviation, sending lots of cadres into the countryside, but as well as looking at the flies and the tigers. There's been over 2 million CPC members processed, and 800,000 members actually expelled. You have people all the way up to the Politburo that have, former ministers, governors, and presidents of former banks really being addressed. So I just want to shape that as a part of the process of reforming this new era, and what we're expected to see today. Not saying that corruption is the big part, but it's a big aspect of what has really gained a lot of the confidence of the public. Because if you ask really any regular person and say, "Oh, what is the biggest problem 10 years ago?" corruption would have been on the top of their lists. So that gives a little bit of the context. But I guess what these national congresses are about, the CPC is a huge ship. It's a party of 96 million members. It's the world's largest governing body. So it's a huge event, and it's held every 5 years, where the party's top leadership gets elected, and it kind of signals the direction of the country. And I was taking us back, 2 terms ago, where corruption was really signaled as an important part. But there's a huge process that actually takes place over the course of the year. It's not just this event. The year before, there's different kind of what's called electoral committees. Could be at the provincial levels or various sectors, that they have their kind of process of nominating candidates, reviewing nominations, voting in their electoral units, and then they kind of select all in total over 2,000 delegates that will attend this Congress. And the role of these delegates at this Congress is basically to elect the levels of leadership above them. So above that is the Central Committee, which is about 300 members. Above that is the Politburo of 25 members. And at the very top is the Standing Committee. I mean, that's quite a bit of jargon, but I think what's important to know is this is actually a large consultative process that takes on actually years and months of work to arrive at this week-long conference.
It's so interesting hearing you break all that down, and then versus I was perusing before some of the headlines in the Western press, and I don't know if you've taken a look, but it's all about Xi Jinping seeks to get third term and consolidate power, and it's all about what you described is actually something that it sounds like a lot of people, a huge number of people actually participate in, coming to a decision not just about the leader, but leaders across the party. So not just the leader of China, but I'm just curious about the conversation that will be had, maybe is being had, about sort of global politics as this is happening. I can't imagine it's separate, right? It's you can't separate what's happening internally in China with what's happening outside, especially when you have countries like the UK and the US within this week alone saying that China is a national security threat. You have the issue of Taiwan that's always hovering over everything right now as the US attempts to take on both Russia and China at the same time in proxy war style. You also have the sort of consolidation of global South countries coming together in big organizations like BRICS, and then other sort of economic organizations as well, like the Shanghai Cooperation Council and so on. You also have the ideological aspect of this, with China as this socialist country. I don't know, how do those elements play into the conversations that are being had around this 20th National Congress meeting?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, just a few days ago, by the adding to the list of Biden sanctions that keeps on growing that we can't really keep tabs on anymore, we have the new export control policy on artificial intelligence and the whole chip battle. And this comes off of a series of legislation like the CHIPS Act, right, to kind of target these so-called choke points of China. And that's just indicative of this, escalating new Cold War aggressions against China that we've been seeing. But on the other hand, and I'm glad you brought up, BRICS and SCO and sort of another, I think, movement that is happening that China's playing a key role in. And I want to just point back to, Xi's first international visit since the pandemic, just a couple of weeks ago, when he went to Samarkand, Uzbekistan. And I think that's quite interesting and symbolic, not just because these two countries have, millennial relationships between civilizations since the Silk Road, but also because that's where Xi Jinping actually announced his flagship Belt and Road Initiative back in 2013. Now there's almost 150 countries that have participated, that have contributed to over $160 billion in infrastructure, mostly at the global south. And so that was at the meeting of the SCO, right? And the SCO, though maybe not a lot of listeners necessarily know about it, but I mean, these 9 Eurasian countries represent, a quarter of the world's GDP and over 40% of the world's population. And I mean, just as a comparison, the G7 that, represents 50% of the global wealth is only 10% of the world population. Wow. So right. What this means, I think it's a really strong signal beyond economic terms, is around these new blocks and a potential to challenge US imperialism and hegemony, And I think one of the key words that came out of that conference is around mutual. mutual development, mutual existence, and it harkens back, I think, to a long history of third world solidarity we've seen, back to the Bandung spirit of the Afro-Asian Conference in Indonesia, the non-aligned movement. I think there is a moment right now we're looking at a new alignment of forces that is looking for a different multipolar or peaceful coexistence future that is less about war and aggression and one about, mutual development.
No, I think that's a very well taken point, and I think certainly, in the context of everything happening all around the world, we were talking at the top of this show about Brazil's election and what that could mean for the sort of global balance of forces, and it really seems China's sort of anchoring role in being able to provide the possibility of a different way of looking at things is just becoming a bigger and bigger factor in the country. And one of the things that really struck me too about the conversation around the party congress, and certainly one that I know the party is putting emphasis on, is, the increased level of diversity, certainly from national minorities, also from women. Certainly one thing that stood out to me is that there are also workers there, which probably doesn't seem that strange in a way because it's a Chinese Communist Party. But, obviously the U.S. Congress is just a bunch of millionaires and things like that. But it does seem like that's also an important element of sort of the way this plays out and sort of what people see in terms of the images and things like that, as it gives a sense of the depth and the breadth of the country, which I think is often presented in a very sort of narrow way of what people think, China or to be Chinese actually is or what it means.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's about 11% of the candidates that have been elected through this rigorous process that represent the 40 or so ethnic minority groups. And that's actually proportionally speaking far beyond the number of actual ethnic minorities in the country. And about 27% are women, which I think we can still improve on in that sense. And I think, and about workers and sort of in a variety of sectors, including service and industrial and agriculture, is about 37%. So, and a lot of the other party members are really the people working on the front lines and in the kind of grassroots communities as well. So it does represent a broad sectors of the Chinese society. And that's probably why it takes a whole year of rigorous consultations to get these 2,000 people's names announced. And what I think is actually really not funny, but interesting is the list was actually published shortly after, I think, the kind of Western media craze about the supposed coup or, Xi's disappearance, if you all remember a couple of weeks ago. I'm like, no, the candidates are here. They're going to be attending. And I'm living in Beijing now, and I'm pretty sure things are just fine.
Can you, what's at stake here? Why is this obviously 20th, is a big number. 20 is a big number, but why is this so important? Why is there international media coverage? I know the international media, the Western media obsesses over everything that happens in China, but in this particular case, why is this moment right now so incredibly important?
I think beyond, the question of, the importance of the shifting leadership, it will bring a new generation. Of course, we're not doubting that Xi Jinping will get reelected into his third term, but there are a lot of big questions of who will take the top positions. For example, the Premier Li Keqiang has already announced his retirement. So there are very significant roles that will shape the direction of this country, but which of course has an impact on the world. But I guess maybe I want to point to one really interesting thing, and perhaps it speaks a little bit of the fear of the West, is just a few weeks ago, there's a party paper called 求是, which is, it publishes a bunch of, the way the party thinks, and included one of Xi's internal speeches from 2018. So this was made public for the first time, just before the Congress. And I think for anyone who is interested in building socialism or a socialist, it's quite an interesting document. And it's a strong affirmation of Marxism and a history of world socialism. And it's quite interesting because Xi actually cites Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao, and kind of highlights sort of how he sees the China's importance in this continuity of a world socialist project, and identifying specifically the importance after the Soviet collapse. And there's a quote I quite find interesting, and he says, if socialism had not achieved this current success in China, then the practice of socialism might have to wander back into the obscurity for a long time. again, like a ghost wandering through the world, as Mark said, or the specter haunting, right? So it was a reminder to say, okay, we have to remember we're communists, we're revolutionaries, we can't lose our revolutionary spirit. These words, I think, can be quite scary to the West and to the capitalist West. So I think in some ways this says a strong message about what we can expect with this next 20th National Congress and then the years following. So as socialists, we have to keep an eye on what's next here in this country.
Mm-hmm. Well, and let me just ask you this finally before we let you go, sort of on that note, Tings. I mean, I think one of the things that also happens at these events, it's a big sort of looking forward, obviously 101 years of the Communist Party of China. So sort of moving into the next phase, I think it's building a modern socialist society in all respects. Hopefully I got that one right. But I think this is a big issue, though, because a huge piece of the question in America is like, what is China's real agenda? What are they trying to accomplish? So, I mean, if you could maybe give us a sense of that vision for what this sort of next phase is in a general sense, I think that's sort of an important aspect for a lot of people listening here in the U.S.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think in 2020, we saw some really important achievements and this path to building a modern socialist project, which is looking at the poverty question, especially in the countryside. And I think what was kind of revealed in this process is that, you know, the fast economic growth that China experienced in the last 4 decades really created amazing successes, never been happened in history, but it created a lot of issues as well. And so I think one of the agendas is going to be what we've been seeing a lot is addressing inequality. Which has been framed under the Common Prosperity Vision, looking at this rural-urban divide that still exists between East and West. So we expect that this to be a big part of sort of the next phase of kind of towards a modern socialist project. And you got it right, Eugene. I think we're going to see other aspects about a good assessment of what the COVID fight has been like and what's next for the zero COVID policy, you know, as China moves into the next phase. I think there'll be a lot of a discussion likely on these key industries that China needs to develop, not just to kind of move up the kind of productive chain, you know, it still is the manufacturer of the world, but also in these higher tech areas where we're seeing a very big geopolitical a struggle that's happening, whether it's in AI, whether it's in chips and a variety of sectors. So that's a question for actual national sovereignty. And I think it's a question of national sovereignty, not only for China, but also for the rest of the world, particularly of the global south. And initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative that we mentioned briefly is a signal towards a possibility for other countries to develop in a more independent and sovereign way.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, Tings, really appreciate you being willing to join us at what I'm sure is a very inopportune time for you. But thanks so much, as always. Can't recommend more highly Dongsheng News Collective. Also, of course, Tricontinental Institute for Social Research doing great work. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you.